developed world, with more than 1 million prisoners behind bars. One of them is Jermar Arnold, a product of a prison policy that has turned around 180 degrees in the past 30 years. Jermar Arnold was already serving a 30-year sentence in one of California's toughest prisons when he confessed to a jewelry store murder 5 years before in Corpus Christi, Texas.
I looked into it and I realized that Texas, Florida, and Georgia are states where they do execute people. And I can't accept being locked up for the next 30 years, so I prefer to be executed.
You heard right. Jermar Arnold confessed to a murder in which he was not even a suspect because he says he wants the state of Texas to execute him.
Why are you so intent upon being put to death?
Well, Mr. Wallace, I guess just to be quite blunt, I don't feel I have anything left to live for.
But that is not how Jermar Arnold felt when he was a straight-A high school student in the farming community of Liberal, Kansas, the oldest of 3 boys in a stable, middle-class family. One teacher remembered him as an outstanding student, headed for the University of Kansas on a full scholarship.
Well, he was very active in speech. He was a singer. He sang the madrigals in the chorale group. He has a deep bass voice. He had a rendition of Old Man River that just wouldn't quit, that I always loved to hear him sing.
But then there were some burglaries and 2 rapes. Jermar Arnold, the talented straight-A scholar, had gone wrong and had begun his descent into the maelstrom of prison life. Dr. Dennis Shepard observed his behavior in California, where he repeatedly attacked fellow inmates.
He took a mop wringer, a heavy metal mop wringer, and attacked another inmate by striking him in the head with that mop wringer. And during a trial for that assault, and while restrained in belly chains and handcuffs, he ripped a faucet off the wall and attacked another person being held without apparent motive.
It's almost surreal sitting here with you. You have a mild manner, mild voice. You're obviously well educated. You're very articulate, thoughtful. And you're a lousy brute. A killer, rapist.
I'm not a very nice person. Given the right circumstances, I can become all of those things.
No one can say exactly what changed Jermar Arnold or why he began his descent into crime, but everyone, including Arnold himself, agrees the criminal justice system brought out the worst in him.
You say that you've lost respect for human life in prison.
Yes, sir, including my own. I don't even have any regard for my own life.
Texas law doesn't allow a defendant to plead guilty to a charge for which death is the punishment. So the Texas courts appointed private investigator Catherine DeYounger to try to thwart Arnold's attempt to receive the death penalty.
If I had to live where Jermar lives, in a cell that is 6 by 6, I saw a diagram of it where you do not see the sun, you do not see the light of day, you don't have any human companionship, you have no contact with the outside world, you're out twice a week for just a bare minimum to take a shower, and you're going to live like that for 30 years. I can see why somebody would want the state of Texas to commit suicide for them, but I don't think it should happen.
Nonetheless, in 1990, Jermar Arnold was sent to Corpus Christi, Texas, where he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death by lethal injection, a decision which gave him an ending to a poem he wrote about his incarceration called House of Pain.
And though now I'm condemned to die, and in this world all alone, I vow never to get weak or cry, 'cause my battered heart has turned to stone.
But as it turned out, Jermar Arnold changed his mind and appealed his sentence. But he did not change his violent ways. 5 years later, while his appeal moved through the courts, he got into a fight with another inmate on death row and before the guards could intervene, he stabbed the man to death with a homemade knife. He remains on death row. Jamar Arnold is admittedly an extreme example of what prison can do to people. Over the years, most criminals who enter our nation's prisons seldom improve their lives, seldom become rehabilitated, quite the opposite. What they learn in prison only makes them worse.
I didn't know anything really about crime until I went there, and they schooled me. And when I came out, instead of stealing a car or a bicycle or what have you, I was ready for the gun.
That is why many Americans came to believe in the idealistic 60s that prisons should be used to rehabilitate criminals. To many, harsh punishment seemed counterproductive.
Because it hasn't paid off, because we haven't been able to demonstrate that repressive measures or the lash or physical punishments or whatever this is pays off, it tends to embitter.
And that is why many Americans believe that new programs, more educational programs in prison, might help keep convicts from returning to prison over and over again. But by the 1970s, the character of convicts themselves had begun to change. That was clear to wardens like Wayne Patterson of Colorado State Prison.
We have a prisoner coming in who is much more violence-prone than any. He has a different outlook. He is probably used drugs, probably very little educated. The crime more relates to person than to property anymore.
That change in the prison population was underlined by the bloody Attica prison riot in September of 1971. 10 hostages and 33 inmates died in the uprising. Sparked by racial tensions between white prison guards and minority inmates, the riot sent shockwaves through penitentiaries all across America. And the bloodshed confirmed for many Americans a trend that seemed to be underway across the country. Crime had become more random, more violent. The politicians told Americans the answer to the rise in crime was to get tough on criminals. And Americans agreed. Convicts in a Colorado prison could read the writing on the wall.
Punishment is probably the only method that America is going to accept. And this is what America wants.
But turning to harsher, mandatory prison sentences, in other words, locking up the crooks and throwing away the key, has caused its own problems.
They run the show back there.
What do you mean they run the show?
It's not our standards and our rules that people are following. It's their own standards, their own rules, which are based on the absolute worst understanding of human nature and expectations about humans.
Such as?
Such as that the toughest person is going to get over. The most violent, the craziest, the person quickest to cross the line, the strongest, the person with the largest clique, the person with the best weapons, that kind of thing. That's who's going to set the standards inside the tier.
Markham learned he could not rely on prison guards for help. Instead, he learned that prisoners were responsible for their own survival.
Violence permeated everything. I mean, day in and day out. Everything you did, you kind of looked at in the context of, could this get me killed? Could this get me raped? Could this get somebody else killed?
Did you have a weapon?
Various times in my career inside, I had weapons. Yeah.
Did you ever use them?
Once or twice. Not something, and it's important for me to say this, not something I'm proud of. But it became clear to me after a while inside that if I didn't show that I was capable of defending myself, that I was going to end up a victim very shortly.
To survive, he learned how to make armor by stuffing magazines in his clothes, and how to command respect from other inmates by challenging the system.
What kind of a prisoner were you?
Pain in the ass. The kind of prisoner that I definitely wouldn't want in any of my jails.
You were an organizer?
Yeah.
Troublemaker?
Yeah, an organizer. Troublemaker for staff, but an organizer.
In the late 1960s, during the heyday of the prison reform movement, Markham had organized food strikes and yard strikes, and he co-founded the United Prisoners Union.
I could not accept that something this cancerous, ugly, and dishonest could exist in the middle of our society. It was like a monster factory, you know, people literally getting worse and worse and worse more and more and more violent, and then going back out onto the streets. And we were calling it rehabilitation at the time.
When Markham left prison, not only did he go straight, he began working in corrections. He did so well, he was able to help design the kind of jail he thought might work. A jail with no bars or heavy metal doors separating the inmates from the guards.
We take away the glory, the glamour of being a convict in a tough joint. I mean, we start calling them by name. When we start saying, you don't have a high school diploma, you've got to get one. You don't know how to read, you're going to learn how to read. You've been beating your wife. What do you think this means to your kids that you keep talking about? People lose that whole convict persona and become vulnerable people who are ready for some sort of help.
But Markham's methods were the exception rather than the rule. Most prisons were just trying to cope with the tidal wave of new inmates that came pouring in during the Get Tough 80s. Many of the prisons were simply overwhelmed.
Prisoners at Washington, D.C.'s Lorton Reformatory in the Virginia suburbs torched 13 buildings just 12 hours after a newspaper headlined a prison expert's report that overcrowding was so bad a major disturbance could occur in the near future. 22 inmates, 2 guards, and 6 firefighters were injured.
Overcrowded. They've got 90 people in each dormitory talking about double bunking.
The flames which burned at Lorton light up a problem which is nationwide.
What happened there today, unfortunately, could happen almost any place in the country.
That is why in 1986, many prisons had been placed under court orders limiting their population because of overcrowding. From 1980 to 86, the prison population in the United States increased by 65%. And with overcrowding came more violence.
Inside California's toughest prisons. Behind these bars, the prisoners are getting away with murder. Most of these inmates have been convicted of violent crimes, and violence is a way of life in prison. But even here, in maximum security, one inmate can kill another, and more often than not, he'll never be convicted. Since 1979, there have been 62 inmate murders in San Quentin and Folsom, considered California's most notorious prisons. The number of convictions, 1. And what message does that send the inmates?
Well, I think the message would have to be that they have a reasonable chance of avoiding prosecution.
Theodore Stevenson was stabbed to death inside Folsom Prison in 1984. They never found out who killed him.
I don't really think they're doing anything because that is the impression they gave me, that they really don't care.
Prison murders are hard to prosecute. There's not much evidence. Bloodstains, perhaps, and maybe a crude homemade knife. And witnesses are too scared to talk.
If you saw one inmate kill another inmate here, would you tell the officers who did it?
Nope.
Why not?
It's just the rule of the institution.
In 1984, there were 25 murders in Texas state prisons and 27 murders in 1985, so the prosecutors decided to get tough. They aggressively pursued the murderers and gave protection to inmates who testified. As a result, the conviction rate rose to 90% and the murder rate dropped.
I think the message that we send is that if you commit a crime in Texas Department of Corrections, you're going to be prosecuted, and you're going to be prosecuted aggressively, and you're going to pay for the crimes you commit.
California got tough too. Behind the razor wire, the concrete windowless high-tech security housing unit, the SHU at Pelican Bay, built at a cost of $250 million, the SHU holds 1,500 inmates, incorrigible, sent there from other California prisons.
If you commit 5 murders on the outside, you don't go to Pelican Bay. If you commit 10 murders on the outside, you do not go to Pelican Bay. If you stab staff and you stab other inmates, you go to Pelican Bay. What Pelican Bay is for is to isolate those individuals who come into the prison system and cannot behave within the prison system.
It's an act of violence, being caught with weapons, being caught running narcotics, being designated as a prison gang leader or member. That will bring you to this building. It's not what you've done on the streets.
The SHU at Pelican Bay is a massive automated isolation unit with state-of-the-art technology. Inside, there are no bars, instead specially designed steel doors. No direct sunlight ever, and no direct contact with another prisoner. Inmates are kept isolated in their cells under the control of heavily armed guards. Lieutenant Al Dinas took us on a tour.
This is not for bullets. This
No,
is
it's
for...
not. It's to stop penetrating type objects like spears, knives, darts.
The shoe consists of sections. Each section has a 500-foot-long concrete corridor.
You have 3 cell blocks on the left and 3 cell blocks on the right.
Wait a minute. What are you saying? People live behind these walls?
Yes. I would say approximately 550 to 600 inmates.
Behind these gray walls?
Right. Front door, please.
As we said, there are no windows and no direct sunlight inside Pelican Bay's shoe.
Skylights in the pods let light come in down into the pod area that filters through our doors into the cells. This is the design. This is what we call a pod.
Every pod is a small self-contained unit with 8 cells on 2 tiers.
Can we go in there?
No, we cannot. We do not go inside the pod areas.
Because?
Safety and security. We do not let anybody in there but our staff.
Do they mix with each other, all the guys in this pod?
No, they do not. Any communication they have is through the doors. If they come out of their pods, they will come in contact with no other inmate. They can talk, but they have no physical contact.
Good God. And this can go on for years in here?
Depending on the circumstances of the case, it could go on for years.
There's an eerie quality here, Al.
It's different from when you walk into most prisons, the old prisons. You don't have the yelling and the screaming.
Right.
It's very quiet.
Pelican Bay, and that's a success story about isolating predators and victimizers away from regular inmates who want to program and go back into society.
But Dr. Stuart Gracian, a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, an expert on the effects of isolation and solitary confinement, is an outspoken critic of the California Department of Corrections, the CDC, and of the shoe at Pelican Bay.
The CDC tries to create an impression that they're dealing with the incorrigibles, the kind of James Cagney of the prison population. What they're often dealing with is the wretched of the earth, people who are mentally retarded, mentally ill.
Dr. Gracian says that if prisoners aren't psychotic when they arrive at the shoe, many will become psychotic before they leave because of the shoe's environment.
What goes on inside those cells? What goes on inside the minds of these people in there? I mean, in this silent, otherworldly atmosphere.
People describe the walls of their cells start to move in and out. Lights start becoming brighter and duller.
And there's more.
People who are smearing themselves with their own feces, drinking out of their toilet bowl, eating their feces. Even people are eating themselves. Some people in shoe will become howling, violent, agitated, out of control. A good example is the prisoner who describes he hears the faucet dripping, and over time the dripping gets louder and louder and louder, and then he can't stand it, and it starts to drive him out of his mind.
Lopafora Contreras is a transsexual confined to the shoe.
It's like a modern dungeon, 20th century dungeon, high-tech dungeon, with all these little techniques to bend our minds, to break us. And it worked on me. In December, I tried to commit suicide. I jumped off the second tier because they missed my meal again.
James Moore, who has brain damage, was in the shoe suffering from seizures and was given the wrong medication.
I started having delusions. Illusions were coming from the walls, and I was starting having really bad things.
And what kind of treatment did Moore receive then? He says a team of officers came in to extract him from his cell.
When they go in, they have helmets, they got shields, they got towels, they got tasers, they got bulletproof vests on, they got combat boots on, they got steel batons, and they come in and they beat the out of you, man.
California prison officials insist that isolating incorrigible inmates at Pelican Bay makes the whole prison system safer for criminals and correctional officers alike.
It's safe for our staff to work here. It's safe for the inmates incarcerated here.
Yeah, but beyond here.
I can't answer your question. That's beyond us.
But the fact is that inmates, some of them actively psychotic, are regularly paroled directly from Pelican Bay's shoe to the street, with no training, no counseling, no job, and in many cases, nowhere to go.
Is it okay to drive people crazy in an effort to decrease violence in your prison system? Is it okay to release people to the street from Pelican Bay shoe who are far crazier and far more violent than they were when they came into the prison system? I don't think those things are okay.
The shoe at Pelican Bay in California is an expensive, and some will say cruel and futile effort to solve the growing problem of violence in American prisons, where most inmates live in constant fear. But the shoe is an exception. In most of today's packed-to-capacity prisons, it's survival of the strongest and the meanest, a reign of terror that extends beyond the prison walls.
3 grown men go in the chow hall and kill this kid. It was a 24-year-old kid, man. It was over a gambling debt. They pull their knives out and they start stabbing him.
For what? I mean, why were they?
$4.50.
$4.50?
Yes, sir. He laid there on that floor. They stabbed him 50, 60 times, and he started twitching. The other one run back over and cut his throat.
Prison gangs were established along racial lines. Gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, or the AB for short, formed to defend white inmates from black gangs like the Mandingo Warriors.
The blacks outnumbered the whites on my side of the building. The side of the building I was on, about 6 or 7 to 1. And they were taking advantage of their numerical superiority. And most whites, if they weren't paying shakedown or protection money, they were giving up some kind of sexual favor or another, you know. And I didn't go for that. So I ended up having to stab a dude because he tried that routine with me, so I just stabbed him and got it over with. And the only whites I saw who weren't getting taken advantage of or getting beat up or getting raped, getting robbed were the ABs. Because everybody knew the ABs cut the head off if they tried it.
So you joined?
Oh yeah, most definitely. They come to me and ask me to join because they saw that I'd take care of my own business. You know, I'd defend myself when it come down to it.
The prison gangs may have been formed originally for self-defense, but it wasn't long before they turned vicious. Take the case of Pontiac State Prison in Illinois in September of 1987.
Authorities are calling yesterday's murder at Pontiac of Assistant Superintendent Robert Taylor a gang assassination. The 44-year-old Taylor was beaten with a metal pipe and stabbed 4 times with a handmade knife. The prison, located in downstate Livingston County, is on lockdown status, meaning inmates are confined to their cells. With some 1,800 residents at last count, Pontiac is about 40% above its design capacity.
Message is that we're vulnerable, that we are not, and the inmates know it, in these maximum security prisons in a position every day to provide even a modicum of assurance that the employees that are going to work will be able to walk out the same gates that night.
It's dominated by gangs who have turf problems, and they put out hits and contracts. They run different parts of the prison, but they've carved out little fiefdoms for themselves.
The assistant superintendent was killed in his office inside this building at Pontiac Prison. 1 month later, 4 inmates, members of a Chicago street gang, were charged with the murder.
Livingston County State's Attorney Don Bernardi today announced grand jury indictments against the 4 inmates, all of whom already are serving time for previous murders in Cook County. 25-year-old Ike Easley serving 20 years for murder. 32-year-old Roosevelt Lucas serving an 80-year murder sentence. 34-year-old Michael Johnson serving a 35-year sentence for murder. And 24-year-old David Carter serving a 28-year sentence for murder.
This is a case that's clearly underscored gang-related.
What happened in Illinois was not an isolated incident. Prison gang-related crime was sweeping across the country.
Members of prison gangs, men so violent that the maximum security unit at San Quentin Prison is divided into sections for different gangs to keep them from attacking each other and from preying on non-members. State and federal officials say that these gangs are a new and terrifying type of organized crime, with chapters in prisons ranging over 20 states. Gang leaders inside prisons who control vast networks of crime on the streets.
We can trace crimes that occur here in Los Angeles that had their origin, their plan, scheme, and design in Marion, Illinois, or Atlanta, or some other state other than California.
Detective Jim Vuchas runs the Los Angeles Police Department's prison gang unit.
Bank robbery, narcotics is a major source of the funding. Burglaries, extortion, prostitution, loan sharking. They won't hesitate to kill. Fear, intimidation, killing, that's their main weapon.
Law enforcement officials estimate that in California alone, over the last 7 years, Gangs have been responsible for at least 328 killings on the streets, 120 more in the prisons. The Justice Department has now started a new prison gang task force to monitor the gangs and try to control them.
What we would try to do is to place those gang members in places where we can minimize their recruiting efforts. We would try not to, for example, put all of them in the same prison.
But breaking up the prison gangs proved to be impossible. Members took an oath to stay in the gang even after they were released from prison.
Once you're in for life. They're called blood in, blood out organizations. It means you have to be willing to kill somebody to be a member of the group, and if you want to leave the group, that means you'll probably die too.
This undercover law enforcement video shows members of one of the most violent prison gangs, La M, the Mexican Mafia, casually plotting murder.
Okay, well, they will kill him then. I have it, we'll kill him. I said, if he's saying something bad about the Griga, then kill him.
La M, perhaps the most feared of the gangs, was founded in the California prison system back in 1956. Hispanic inmates first banded together to protect themselves. But then, they transformed their small group from prey to predator, seizing control of prison rackets, gambling and narcotics, protection and prostitution.
We could pretty much control any prison where we existed.
Much of what is known about the Mexican Mafia was first learned from Mundo Mendoza, who joined La M in San Quentin back in the early 70s while he was serving a prison term for murder. Meantime, on the streets of Los Angeles, the Mexican Mafia commanded the allegiance of tens of thousands of Hispanic gang members.
The M has a very long arm and it reaches out very far into the federal system. It doesn't just stop there. Like I said, in society, people think that a drive-by shooting will be a drive-by shooting, and in fact will be a homicide Mexican Mafia hit. And it makes it, they use the youngsters, neighborhood prison, street gangs, to make it look like it was a street gang killing, and in fact it wasn't. It was a contract hit from within the walls of the prison.
They run things inside the jail, and they're running things outside the jail right now.
So they're pretty active outside of prison.
Very active. And they're probably more active outside of prison because that's where they're making the money.
La M profited from narcotics not by importing and distributing the drugs themselves, but through extortion.
Well, you sell $100 worth of dope, you got to give the Mexican Mafia $10. I mean, that's an example.
Like a kickback.
Just a kickback.
A kickback, yes, but also a life insurance premium. Street gang members knew that sooner or later they would probably end up in a prison controlled by members of the Mexican Mafia who did not hesitate to kill.
While in custody in the L.A. County Jail, MA member Salvador Buenrostro, who had fallen out of favor with his colleagues, was attacked and stabbed by Mexican Mafia members Topo Peters and Rene Enriquez. Probation officer Georgie O'Connor was only 4 feet away when the attack occurred, in an attorney visiting room. She was one of a room full of witnesses who saw Peters and Enriquez unhandcuff themselves and stab Buenrostro 25 times.
Peters and Enriquez didn't care that there was witnesses. They didn't care that there was 15 or more sheriffs now surrounding them. They continued to stab Buenrostros. And when they thought he was dead, and I was close enough that I thought he was dead, they stopped, and they stood up, and they dropped their weapons, and they turned themselves back over to the sheriff's custody.
How did they get knives, and how did they get keys to the handcuffs?
I don't believe that there's anything that the Mexican Mafia members need that they cannot obtain, no matter whether they're inside a jail or prison facility. They can access weapons, access narcotics, access phones, and access anything that they need to take care of their business.
Americans took care of business by pouring criminals into penitentiaries in the 1980s in unprecedented numbers. And among the people pouring in were American women. For if the equal rights movement was helping American women achieve more equality in the workplace, it also meant that more women were being sent to prison than ever before.
It could be any nursery for infants, but these mothers are inmates at Bedford Hills Prison, the maximum security facility for women convicted of felonies in New York State. It's the only prison in the country that allows pregnant prisoners to keep their babies, but only for a year.
My daughter doesn't know she's in prison. She's with her mother.
And when she goes home, she'll know that I'm not there, but she's had the first year, that foundation, you know, all the love that I've given, everything that I've put in will stay with her, I think.
In 1988, a lot of babies were born in prison, an average of 2 a week at the California Institute for Women, and at least 1 a week at the Texas State Prison for Women.
But there are no babies at either institution, two of the largest in the country. They are taken away from their inmate mothers, often hours after birth. Mothers who stay on good behavior can see their children once a week, like any other visitor, but most of the time only across a barrier.
We have a wall between us and, glass between us. You don't get to hold her. Just look at her.
An estimated 10% of the women sentenced to jail are pregnant when they're locked up. Thousands more leave children behind.
For every mom that's doing time on the inside, there's a child doing time on the outside.
All right, ladies, bed count.
A roll call of motherhood here in North Carolina will show that 3/4 of the inmates, 3/4, are mothers.
Okay, ladies.
You will find that almost 100% of those that were mothers were good mothers.
Faye Lassiter is superintendent of the North Carolina Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh.
They may have been prostitutes, street walkers, but they were good mothers. They took care of their children. They may have robbed a bank, but they still took care of their children.
It was a problem that continued to grow as the number of women in prison increased. In the early 80s, there were about 12,000 women in the nation's prisons. That figure rose to 73,000 by the mid-90s.
While the incarceration rates skyrocketed, increased by 256% in the last decade, the level of violence really stayed the same. About 11% of all violent crimes were committed by women in 1960. And if you look 35 years later, the figure's the same, 12% of all violent crimes committed by women.
Women are going to prison mainly for larceny and for drug violations. The difference is they're staying longer. Because of changing American policies, getting tough on crime and drugs, many laws have been passed requiring mandatory sentences for certain crimes, particularly drug-related crimes. So one of the unintended results of mandatory sentences is that prisons have been filled with women who in former years might have been given probation. And they are also filling up with aging men, too old to commit violent crimes, but who cannot be released.
Aging inmates are among the fastest growing segment of prison population. They have become a nightmare for the nation's prisons, filling hospitals, becoming the most expensive prisoners to keep behind bars.
It adds to our cost. They need more treatment, they need more medicine, they need more medical assistance.
Prisons make pretty bad nursing homes. It's because prisons were developed according to a model of a young, dangerous, healthy prisoner. And for a long time, that model was correct. Most of our prisons were occupied by young, healthy prisoners. Well, that model's fast becoming obsolete as our prison population ages.
In Louisiana, we have life without parole, probation, or suspension sentence.
Angola is one of the largest state penitentiaries in the country. And even so, with 4,500 inmates, the prison is running out of room. That's because Louisiana's tough sentencing law means many inmates come here, but few leave. Those who believe in parole say that long years in a prison wear the wildness out of a man. They're past the age of 40 or 45, 50 certainly. Most outgrow violence.
Horseback guess, the percentage who could be released and probably are not going to do anything again.
I don't have a percentage. I would say out of our population, you're talking 200 or 300.
And they just stay here and...
They stay here and they die.
This is Ward 2 of the prison infirmary where inmates come to die of old age. With ever tougher sentences, Warden Whitley expects to see many more prisons slowly transformed into high-security nursing homes.
3 strikes and you're out, and by golly, that's where they're going to be.
That's where they're going to be, and we're going to be paying for it, and it's going to cost us an awful lot.
It is estimated that by the year 2000, the United States will need the equivalent of 250 large prisons just to hold and care for all of its elderly prisoners, waiting to be buried in places like Angola's cemetery at Point Lookout.
I hate thinking about being buried here, boy.
The inmates tend these grave sites and they pray they will rest elsewhere, anywhere but here.
The Lifers Association, we've done Point Lookout, putting flowers on the graves, and you've seen friends that you know die here, and their families won't come get their body. That's a frightening thing.
Louisiana has the harshest prison sentences in the country.
And it's supposed to be the most dangerous state.
It is listed as the most dangerous state in the Union to live in.
Doesn't make sense, does it?
I think it shows that more prisons and longer sentences are not the answer to the crime problem.
I wouldn't expect those words to come out of your mouth, Warden Whitley.
I wouldn't either, except that I've been working in prisons for 24 years now, and I see what's happening. We can lock up every criminal that commits a crime, and we're taking care of the immediate problem. We're doing nothing to stop the people who are coming up, the youngsters out there today who are going to be the prisoners of tomorrow. We're doing nothing to change their attitude.
We've tried to build our way out of this crime thing, thinking that enough jail cells would do it and enough prison cells would do it. And the data shows it hasn't.
In 1993, Dr. Alan Kalmanoff, a consultant to prison systems around the nation, looked at California and declared its policy of building more and more prisons a disaster.
We are simply building giant factories to make criminals.
In 1993, there were 26 state prisons in California, stretching from the Oregon border in the north to the Mexican border 800 miles to the south. Prisons in the mountains, prisons scattered through the fields of the San Joaquin Valley, including the largest women's penitentiary in the world, all part of the largest prison construction project in history.
We build more prisons, frankly, than we do classrooms. The quality of the prisons physically are better than the quality of the classrooms.
Even so, California's prisons were the most overcrowded in the nation in 1993, running at 180% of capacity. Total cost of prison construction, $8 billion, or nearly $100,000 per cell.
We will spend what is necessary to protect the people on the street. And if it takes more money to build more prisons, to have greater capacity, as we've done in the last decade, I'm willing to go out and fight for that.
Building a new prison, though, is just the beginning. Next, they have to be staffed. And all of that costs a lot of money.
Remember, to get a tower to run 24 hours a day is $250,000 a year. It's very expensive.
The man in the blue fedora is Don Novi. Novi is president of the powerful Prison Guards Union, which represents the state's 23,000 correctional officers. The average salary for a guard is now around $60,000 a year. Those salaries are a reflection of Don Novi's political clout, which comes from the millions that his union contributes to the state's politicians. Today, California's prison guards are the highest paid in the nation. They make 25% more than the state's school teachers.
We deserve every penny. We're here with these guys on a daily basis. These guys are committed felons, murderers, rapists, any kind of crime you can imagine.
But most of these inmates, sunning themselves and pumping iron here, over half of them are in prison for non-violent crimes like drug possession and drug use, petty theft, burglary. So that $25,000 a year in tax money to keep a prisoner here, what does it buy?
You hardly even get any type of program here. No program? No work?
Why is there so much idleness?
Because there's not enough jobs available.
So these guys sit here doing nothing?
That's many of them do. That's in essence what they do. They'll go out and pump iron. They'll watch TV at night. It's basically a warehouse prison.
When they get out, they're not trained for anything?
Nope, that's correct.
They haven't, they're angry?
That's right. And they're going to go out and hurt somebody.
Many of the convicts agree with John Novi.
Why isn't somebody doing something to put some type of programs in here for us?
I've been here 16 months. There's nothing.
See, all your new criminals are young, between the age of 18 and 24, with no education, with no job, with no future. And they're all in prison. If prison doesn't offer them something, if prison doesn't give them some type of way out, or some type of future, or some type of life to look for, America is in big trouble.
If you don't fix it now, and if you don't rehabilitate these guys now, you're going to have to deal with them later on in the street.
But it's hard for Americans in the 90s to consider ways to rehabilitate criminals. That would involve re-examining what is known about criminal behavior and contributing factors like poverty and incest, child abuse, alcohol and drug abuse, and all the rest. Far easier to build more and more prisons and put more and more people in them for longer periods of time without regard for the unintended but long-range consequences. And pity the poor politician who would say otherwise. Being perceived as soft on crime in the 90s was a sure way to lose an election. So, almost by default, the only Americans who seemed willing today to discuss prison problems rationally were bottom-line business people.
So I said, say, fellas, I got an industry for Avenel. And they said, yeah, what is it? And I said, a prison.
Well, everybody kind of laughed. I mean, hell, a prison, that was just too much.
But the local leaders went ahead and got a prison built near Avenel, and that meant new jobs and new money. The prison's annual payroll of $25 million has revitalized the whole area, and it's happening all across the country.
Good morning, Corrections Corporation of America.
Starting in the mid-'80s, private companies have been going into the business of building and running prisons for profit. RCA and E.F. Hutton, for example. The new breed of corporate wardens say they can do the job better than the government.
Here's your break-even break-even population, be 25 people.
We don't sell ourselves as necessarily being cheaper. We sell ourselves as being able to deliver a product. You make the evaluation of whether or not it's cost-effective for you to contract with us.
By 1994, there were about 100 privately owned and operated prisons in 29 states. The jury's still out on how much impact they've had on the crime rate, but the business people involved say that what has worked for them, cost-wise, profit-wise, and otherwise, have been programs designed to give inmates skills and positive attitudes about the future. Sound familiar? In a more hopeful time, it was called rehabilitation. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.